The invincible Soviet tank, destroying any target with a single shot. On June 23, 1941, German soldiers first saw something that seemed like a nightmare to them, for on a dirt road stood something enormous, with a turret resembling a small fortress and a gun barrel so enormous it looked like it had been taken from a warship. The German tank crews fired the first shots from their 37mm cannons, but the shells bounced off the armor like pebbles thrown at a concrete wall. And then came the roar of this monster shot, and one of the German tanks turned into a flaming wreck because the 152mm shell had left practically nothing of it. But this story began much earlier, in the winter of 1939, when the Red Army attacked Finland, expecting a quick and easy victory over its small northern neighbor. The reality turned out to be harsh. The Finnish fortifications of the Mannerheim Line resisted desperately, and the heavy Soviet Kv-2 tanks, although excellent at destroying enemy armored vehicles, proved powerless against the concrete permanent emplacements. The 76mm gun on these tanks could destroy wood and earth positions, but the thick concrete walls of the Finnish forts remained intact even after repeated shelling. And then the Military Council of the Northwestern Front came up with an idea that many would have considered madness: to install a 152mm howitzer on a heavy tank, a weapon typically used in field artillery and capable of striking targets many kilometers away. No one had previously attempted to fit such a powerful gun into an armored vehicle, but the Soviet command approved the project and transferred the task to the design bureau of the Kirov plant in Leningrad. The designers, under the leadership of engineer Kotin, were given only a few days to work. This meant practically front-line conditions. The engineers adopted a barracks-like regime, spending 16 and sometimes even 18 hours a day at the plant. Sleep became a luxury. They ate their food right at their drawing boards because every hour of delay meant new losses on the Finnish front. In this feverish atmosphere, a project was born that would transform Soviet armored vehicles. True, it turned out quite differently than its creators had dreamed. The problem was that the M10 152mm howitzer was enormous and heavy, and it simply wouldn't fit into the standard Kv-2 tank turret. The designers were forced to design an entirely new turret, much larger than anything previously installed on tanks. It had to accommodate not only the gun itself, but also the recoil mechanisms, the breech, the sights, and the ammunition supply. The result looked so strange that soldiers immediately started joking, saying someone had put a small shed or a sentry box on the tank. The turret was disproportionately tall and massive compared to the rest of the vehicle. On February 10, 1940, the first prototype with the enormous turret began firing trials right on the grounds of the Kirov plant. There was no time to transport them to the proving grounds. The results were deemed satisfactory, and the chassis withstood the monstrous recoil. And already on February 17th, both completed prototypes were sent directly to the Finnish front for their baptism of fire. At that time, no one was wondering whether the vehicle was ready for war. What mattered was the speed of delivery of the new weapon to the battlefield. On the Mannerheim Line, the new tanks truly lived up to expectations. Their 152mm shells crushed the concrete walls of fortifications, which had withstood all other weapons for weeks. Red Army soldiers watched in admiration as the steel giant reduced the bunker which had cost hundreds of their comrades to rubble. And the Finnish defenders had no weapon capable of penetrating the 75mm thick armor of this new monster. After the war with Finland, the Soviet command was delighted, overlooking or ignoring a multitude of shortcomings that would soon become fully apparent. The design of the new heavy tank concealed serious problems that came to light during more thorough testing after the end of the Finnish campaign. The engineers at the Kirov plant understood that they had created a vehicle full of compromises. The gigantic turret with a howitzer was an impressive solution on paper, but far from ideal. The biggest nightmare turned out to be the turret's balance, or rather, its almost complete lack thereof. The gun itself was balanced in its mountings, but the turret's center of gravity as a whole was offset from the axis of rotation. In practice, this led to disaster for the crew. As soon as the tank slid onto even a slight incline, the electric turret traverse drive could no longer cope with the uneven weight. Back then, the crew had to abandon the electric drive and manually rotate the multi-ton turret using a crank. This required enormous effort and consumed precious minutes, during which the tank was vulnerable to attack from the side or rear. Aiming the howitzer also posed problems unfamiliar to crews of other tanks. Common aiming involved traversing the entire turret horizontally, and the barrel's elevation angles were limited to a range of -3 to +1 degree. For more accurate fire, the so-called howitzer feature was introduced.
For precision aiming, the turret was fixed and the barrel moved in a very narrow horizontal sector, only a few degrees. At the proving ground, this worked acceptably, but in combat, where it is necessary to react instantly to a changing situation, the system proved too slow and inadequate. Another oddity was the huge steel hatch in the rear wall of the turret, more like a bunker door than an element of a combat vehicle. This opening was used at the factory to install the howitzer because it was physically impossible to drag such a weapon through a standard hatch. In line units, the hatch served for loading ammunition, servicing mechanisms, and boarding or disembarking part of the crew. The solution was practical, but at the same time it became a potentially weak point in the armor. The ammunition load consisted of only 36 separate loading rounds. Each shot consisted of 2 parts that had to be loaded separately. First, the projectile, then the propellant charge. Each component weighed tens of kilograms, and loading required the coordinated work of 2 crew members in a cramped turret, filled with gunpowder smoke and heated by the shots. The howitzer's rate of fire was only 2 or 3 shots per minute in ideal conditions. In real combat, it often dropped even lower. The crew had to simultaneously observe the battlefield, adjust aiming, and maintain communications. Initially, it was planned to supply the crews only with high-explosive howitzer shells of the 0530 type for destroying field fortifications and concentrations of infantry. But the experience of the Finnish War quickly expanded the list of permissible ammunition. On the Mannerheim Line, it became clear that special anti-concrete shells were needed to penetrate thick concrete. They were urgently included in the standard ammunition load. Later, other types of shells used in field howitzers of the same caliber were added. Theoretically, this gave the crew flexibility, but in practice, each type required different sight settings and a different propellant charge, which further complicated the already difficult work of the crew. In the second half of 1940, engineers of Design Bureau No. 2 began modernizing the turret based on comments from the military received during front-line trials. The new version, designated MT2, became lower. The silhouette improved slightly, although the tank still remained the tallest in the Red Army. The shape of the turret's frontal plate was changed. Instead of a trapezoid, a rectangle was made. This was simpler to manufacture. The gun mask was redesigned, and a number of minor improvements were made to make life a little easier for the crew. In early 1941, the People's Commissariat of Defense officially adopted the modernized tank into service under the designation Kv-2, and serial production was launched at the Leningrad Kirov plant. The Red Army Command was confident that they now had the most powerful armored vehicle in the world, capable of destroying any target with a single shot and invulnerable to any enemy weapon. No one suspected that very soon this steel fortress on tracks would become a symbol not so much of strength, but of dramatic helplessness in the face of the chaos of real war. On June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht crossed the borders of the Soviet Union along their entire length, beginning Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. Millions of German soldiers, armed with proven weapons and led by experienced officers, moved eastward, confident of a quick victory over an enemy they considered weak and disorganized. The very next day, some of them were forced to painfully reconsider these beliefs. On the country roads of the western part of the Soviet Union, they encountered something the German army had never seen before. The crews of German tanks of the second and third models, accustomed to dominating in France and Poland, suddenly found themselves face to face with machines against which their weapons were useless. 37mm caliber cannons, which until then had coped with almost any opponent, now only produced sparks on the armor of the Soviet giants without causing them any noticeable harm. German soldiers watched in horror as shells ricocheted off the thick steel plates, and how in response a volley arrived capable of turning their machine into burning wreckage. According to numerous accounts collected after the war, German tank crews initially couldn't believe their eyes when they saw the silhouette of a Kv-2 on the horizon. The turret looked like a small bunker placed on a tracked chassis. Some reported to their superiors about mobile fortifications or vehicles with siege artillery. No one could believe that it was actually a tank. The impression was reinforced by the thick barrel of the howitzer. It seemed that an adult's head could fit inside, and the overall dimensions of the machine, which surpassed everything that the armies of Europe had at that time. Ordinary German anti-tank weapons proved powerless against this beast. The rolled steel armor, 75mm thick, easily stopped any tank gun shell and most anti-tank guns. The only weapon capable of reliably penetrating such protection was the 88mm caliber anti-aircraft guns, which the Wehrmacht had to hastily deploy against it.
Anti-tank role risking leaving units without cover from Soviet aviation. The problem was that these guns were heavy and not very mobile, and their relocation took up precious time, which was constantly lacking in the chaos of the first days of the war. The German command quickly developed tactics to combat the Soviet giants because, despite their formidable appearance, these machines had weak points. The most reliable method was a direct hit on the gun barrel or the running gear. Damage to the tracks or road wheels immobilized the tank, and without the main armament, the crew had only 3 machine guns. When the tank was stopped, the matter passed to the infantry and sappers. Under the cover of smoke, they crept up to the steel giant and planted explosives under the turret or on the engine compartment. But the real threat to the Kv-2 came not so much from German guns and sappers, but from a completely unexpected direction. The chaos of the first weeks of the war led to the actual collapse of Soviet military logistics. Fuel and ammunition depots were bombed or captured by rapidly advancing German columns. The crews of heavy tanks found themselves in a desperate situation. Their machines consumed enormous amounts of fuel, and every shot from the howitzer meant a raskhod of shells that could not be replenished. The 50-ton steel fortresses designed to break through fortified lines proved tragically unsuitable for maneuver warfare, where speed and the ability to act autonomously are decisive. Fuel consumption was measured in hundreds of liters for every 100 kilometers of march, and the Soviet fuel supply system could not provide regular deliveries to tank units scattered across the entire front. More and more often, the powerful machines would break down on the side of the roads with empty tanks, and their crews would hopelessly wait for a fuel tanker that never arrived. The reliability of the complex mechanisms became an equally serious problem. The heavy chassis and overloaded turret accelerated the wear and tear of the transmission, running gear, and engine. Field workshops lacked both spare parts and the equipment necessary to repair such large and capricious machines. Evacuating damaged tanks required heavy tow trucks, which were in short supply throughout the entire front. More and more steel giants ended their service not from German hits, but from breakdowns that simply could not be repaired due to a lack of personnel and equipment. Archival documents of the 41st Tank Division of the Red Army have survived to this day and tell a story that better than any memoirs shows the tragic fate of the Soviet steel giants. This unit entered battle in June 1941 with 33 Kv-2 tanks. On paper, this was a force theoretically capable of destroying an entire German tank division. But reality turned out to be quite different from the optimistic calculations of the staff officers who drew arrows on maps in their quiet offices. Of the 33 machines, only about 5 were lost in direct combat with the enemy. That is, German guns and shells accounted for less than 1/6 of all the division's losses. The remaining 2/3 of these monstrous combat vehicles were abandoned by their crews during the retreat because there wasn't enough fuel to tow the 50-ton behemoths, or there was no way to repair the damaged mechanisms. Soldiers next to their stalled machines made terrible decisions: to hold out until the last bullet, or to blow up the tank and leave on foot. The Germans quickly realized that the battlefields of the summer of 1941 were a real treasure trove of abandoned Soviet equipment, often in almost factory condition. Reconnaissance patrols regularly reported heavy tanks standing by the road with no signs of combat damage, with empty tanks, or with minor malfunctions that Soviet mechanics could have fixed in a few hours. German technical services initially didn't know what to do with such machines. Their size and weight exceeded anything they had encountered before. The Wehrmacht officially included captured Soviet heavy tanks in its arsenal under the designation PZKPFW Kv-2 756R. The letter R in parentheses indicated Russian origin. German crews, accustomed to light and medium tanks, had to learn to operate a completely different machine, with specific controls, a complex loading system, and a capricious diesel engine. Despite the difficulties, the captured vehicles ended up in line units and were used as support in breaking through fortified positions, exactly in the role for which they were originally intended by Soviet designers. The production of new Kv-2 tanks in the Soviet Union continued until October 1941, when the Leningrad Kirov plant had to be evacuated to the interior of the country due to the approaching front. The exact number of vehicles produced remains a subject of debate among historians. Different sources cite different figures. Most often, the estimate is around 330 or 340 tanks. However, some documents indicate that the plant in Perm was only able to manufacture 100 sets of suspension mechanisms for the howitzer, which could mean a much lower actual number of finished vehicles. The first months of the war decimated the Soviet armored forces at a rate that no one expected. Kv-2s disappeared from the battlefields at an alarming rate.
Faster than any other type of tank. The complexity of the design, the monstrous supply requirements, and chronic logistical failures led to the fact that by the spring of 1942, most of these machines no longer existed, destroyed by the enemy or abandoned by their own crews. The few remaining examples that survived the most difficult period continued to serve in secondary units, but their role became increasingly marginal as the Red Army received more modern equipment. In 1943, the command decided to withdraw the remaining Kv-2s from direct combat service and convert them into heavy recovery vehicles. The engines of these tanks, although capricious and fuel-hungry, were perfectly suited for towing damaged equipment from the battlefield, and the thick armor protected the rescue crews under fire during risky operations to retrieve damaged vehicles. Thus, the steel giants, created to destroy fortifications, ended their careers as auxiliary vehicles. The fate of captured Kv-2s in German service was also strange. These tanks managed to fight on both sides of the front for almost the entire war. The last documented case of combat use of one of these machines occurred in April 1945 during the defense of Königsberg, when a German crew fought in a Soviet tank against the Red Army. This Soviet machine, captured almost 4 years earlier, was destroyed by the same troops that created it, symbolically closing the circle of this incredible story. When the last shots fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the fate of the Soviet steel giants with their enormous turrets had long been sealed.
Of the more than 300 machines produced at the Leningrad Kirov plant, most perished in the first months of the war, scattered across the fields, forests, and roads of the western part of the Soviet Union. Some burned from German hits, others exploded after the detonation of their ammunition, but the vast majority simply broke down. Empty fuel tanks, broken mechanisms, and neither the men, nor the time, nor the resources to save them. Post-war commissions tried to calculate the losses and determine what had happened to each of these expensive machines. The results were grim for Soviet military planners. It turned out that the enemy had destroyed only a small percentage of the Kv-2s in battle, while everything else became a victim of technical problems, logistics, and banal military chaos. The armor that protected the crew from enemy shells made the tank so heavy that most bridges could not withstand its weight, and dirt roads turned into mud traps from which there was no escape. Red Army soldiers who survived the first months of the war recalled their service on these machines with mixed feelings. On one hand, pride. They were driving the most powerful tank in the world. On the other hand, helplessness and rage when their steel home suddenly refused to obey. One veteran described the moment when the crew was forced to abandon a perfectly functional tank simply because they ran out of fuel and the supply column had been bombed by German aircraft somewhere in the rear. Another recalled the hours spent trying to rotate the turret, which had jammed after the tank got stuck in a bomb crater at the wrong angle. The story of the Kv-2 is, in essence, a story of the clash of ambitious designs with the harsh reality of the battlefield. Soviet designers created a weapon that was incredibly powerful on paper, but tragically impractical in real warfare. The idea of putting a siege howitzer on a mobile armored chassis sounded revolutionary and promising, but its implementation required compromises that ultimately negated the combat value of the entire design. Too heavy a turret, too high fuel consumption, too complex mechanisms, too few spare parts, too weak supply infrastructure. All of this together became a recipe for disaster. The paradox is that it was both too strong and too weak for its task. Its gun could destroy any target on the battlefield, but too often it didn't manage to fire more than a few shots before another breakdown or before supplies ran out. Soldiers feared encountering this steel monster, but quickly realized that it was enough to wait and the Colossus would betray itself with its mechanics or lack of supplies. In a sense, the Kv-2 became a symbol of the Red Army of the summer of 1941, powerful on paper but paralyzed by internal problems and external circumstances. Some military historians wonder, could events in the East have unfolded differently if the Soviet command had made better use of heavy tanks? The answer is not so simple. The very appearance of the Kv-2 on the front lines did indeed slow down the German offensive and force the Wehrmacht to expend resources fighting individual tanks that could block entire columns for many hours. However, these local successes could not change the overall picture. Soviet industry and supply system were not ready to keep such demanding machines in constant combat readiness. After the war, Soviet engineers drew conclusions from the failure of the super-heavy assault tank concept, and they never again attempted to mount siege artillery on a mobile armored chassis. Subsequent generations of Soviet tanks were designed with an emphasis on reliability, ease of maintenance, and mass production, rather than maximum firepower at any cost. The Kv-2 lesson proved painful but valuable. Even the most powerful weapon is useless if it cannot be delivered to the battlefield in time and kept in working order. Of the more than 300 units produced, only one original tank has survived to this day. It can now be seen at the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow. Another vehicle, outwardly resembling the Kv-2, is in the Northern Fleet Aviation Museum. But it was built much later on the basis of another heavy tank, the IS-2, specifically for filming a feature film about the fate of the crew of such a vehicle. This replica is a testament to how long the interest in this unusual tank has persisted. Even having lost on the real battlefield, it went down in history as one of the most original and spectacular armored projects of World War II. The story of the steel giant the size of a small house shows, in war, the one with the biggest gun and the thickest armor doesn't always win. True victory depends on thousands of little things that must work together for the complex war machine to function at all. The Kv-2 was a product of an era when Soviet designers believed that any problem could be solved by adding a bigger gun and thicker steel without thinking about the consequences for supply, reliability, and real-world application. This belief turned out to be an illusion, and the price for it was paid by the crews of the abandoned tanks, who walked back to their lines through forests and fields. If you enjoyed this story and learned something new about World War II, be sure to like the video and write in the comments what you think about this strange and powerful machine. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories about the most unusual and impressive armored vehicles in the history of wars. Many more incredible stories are coming soon.